We've gone over meninges and ventricles, the stuff that covers and protects the brain, both on the outside and also inside of the brain, in the ventricle spaces where cerebrospinal fluid can be found. We're going to talk about the cerebrum now, the main part of the brain that you think of that has all the wrinkly parts, and it's the largest part of your brain. And we'll also see the major divisions of the brain. In the last video, next one, we'll go over the subcortical areas. So first, a little bit about development. How does the brain develop? First, remember that the brain is nervous tissue, and nervous tissue embryonically comes from mesoderm. There's something called this neural tube. I'm sorry, not mesoderm, ectoderm. I don't know why I said that. Ectoderm. Nervous tissue comes from ectoderm. And ectoderm, some of this ectoderm forms a tube, this tube that you can see right here. And from this tube, this differentiates and starts enlarging, and one end of it enlarges into what will become the brain, and the rest of the tube will become the spinal cord. We can roughly divide up this tube into three areas in this where the brain is developing. That roughly develops into a forebrain, because it's in the front, midbrain in the middle, hindbrain, it's in the back, and then the rest of it is the spinal cord. I want to remind you of some directional terms here that we use pretty much only for when referring to the central nervous system. Because we stand upright, the front of our brain is over here, but then the end of our spinal cord is farther down. So we kind of form this curvature. Towards the front of our brain, we call that rostral. Towards the tail of our spinal cord, we call that caudal. Cauda means tail. So as you can see in this picture right here, towards the forebrain, that's rostral. Towards the spinal cord, that's caudal. We can use these directional terms just like we use proximal, distal, anterior, posterior, superior, inferior. Rostral caudal is referring to along this neural axis, this neuraxis. We start with that tube. That tube starts developing more. You can see the forebrain gets even bigger. These areas further develop into specialized brain regions. The forebrain, the very, very front of the forebrain, develops into the cerebrum. The cerebrum you can see pictured right here. This is the cerebrum. There's a smaller part of the forebrain that starts, it's a little bit smaller. It doesn't get as big as the cerebrum. That's the diencephalon. Funny word here, diencephalon. The midbrain is pictured here in this light blue. Midbrain stays as the midbrain. For the hindbrain, that differentiates. We get the cerebellum and the pons developing here in the back, and then the stem, the main part of the stem, that will form here as the medulla oblongata. The word medulla means center portion. Oblongata means it's elongated. It's the elongated center of the brain. Center is kind of like think of like the center of when you hold a thing of cotton candy. You've got your little handle. That's kind of like the stem, the brain stem, and then the cotton candy kind of envelops your hand and envelops the stem. It's center in that way. It's not the center of the actual cerebrum. It's the center of the whole thing where you hold it. That'll be more apparent as we see this develop further. So once again, forebrain gets even bigger, especially the cerebrum. Cerebrum gets even bigger. It gets so big that it starts enveloping the diencephalon. It gets so big that it starts to wrinkle. starts folding in on itself. That's a space-saving method of fitting as much tissue as you can in one spot without increasing the size of that space. That's why there are folds, to maximize surface area, maximize how many neurons and glial cells can fit in a contained space. Think about if you have paper, you can fit more paper in one space if you crumple it up and and ball it up really small, fit more. That's what's going on here. And you can see the brainstem, the medulla oblongata down here. And the cerebellum is hiding right here. Most of what you see is the cerebrum. Diencephalon. Midbrain is hiding, but it's over here. And there are other parts, of course, but this is generally what we see. So that's the progression of development. I'm not going to test you on the timing of all this, but this goes throughout fetal development, and our brains continue developing until we're roughly 20-something. Because of all this folding over of the cerebrum, you get spaces, you get pockets of space within the brain. That's how we form ventricles. It forms from the growth of folding over of those inner spaces. The lateral ventricles are within the cerebrum. The lateral ventricles are within the cerebrum. The third ventricle is sandwiched between the diencephalon. The cerebral aqueduct is at the level of the midbrain. And the fourth ventricle is in between cerebellum pons and sort of by the medulla. Let's actually take a look at this in a cadaver brain. I will show you a mid-sagittal view of a cadaver brain. This is from the University of Utah. Let's go backwards a little bit. There, okay. All of this is cerebrum. That's all cerebrum in this mid-sagittal cut of the brain. This area here is where lateral ventricles are on either side, but this is where the lateral ventricle is. If you push through that, you can see a little hole right here. If you push through that hole, you'll get to more space. What you actually see, that tissue you see right there, that's covered by septum, that's the septum pellucidum. So this lateral ventricle is covered by septum pellucidum. The diencephalon is, let me actually edit my drawing here. There. The diencephalon is this roundish region right here. A little more accurately like this. This is the diencephalon. And the third ventricle is this space in between. So if you have the other hemisphere sandwiched, then you'll get this space where there's fluid. This is where the third ventricle would be found. The lateral ventricles, if you remember, are connected to the third ventricle through the interventricular foramina. Since they're lateral, they're not centered, they're not going to see it in this mid-sagittal cut. So that's why I'm not pointing it out here. You can see the third ventricle. The third ventricle will lead to the fourth ventricle through this little passageway. This little passageway is the cerebral aqueduct. And remember, the cerebral aqueduct is found within this region right here called the midbrain. The midbrain, the way I identify it is by identifying the things around it. The diencephalon is this nice rounded region, and you've got the huge cerebrum. This region over here, this huge roundish bulge, this is the pons. And then the cerebellum is the funny branchy tree looking thing here in the back. And then the narrow stalk that goes down this way, that's the medulla oblongata. The fourth ventricle is found in this space between the cerebellum and the pons. So the cerebral aqueduct leads into the fourth ventricle. And then the central canal, which continues from the medulla down to the spinal cord. The central canal is this narrow passageway that continues down from the medulla oblongata down caudally to the spinal cord, through the spinal cord. Switching back to the slides. So as we've seen, we can divide up the brain into several divisions. We have the forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain divisions based on development and which ones are bigger, which ones are smaller. There is a physical name for the division between the cerebrum and the rest. If you look in this lateral view of the brain, this division right here, that's known as the transverse fissure. You can see it also in this posterior view. The transverse fissure is separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Transverse because it's going horizontal. Fissure means a deep crevice. Transverse fissure. Another way that we can divide up the brain is by left and right hemispheres. The hemispheres, the sides of the brain are connected, but there's that big split. The big split down the middle, that's the longitudinal fissure. So we have the longitudinal fissure running this way. We have the transverse fissure running horizontally this way. I said that there are several connections between the left and right sides of the brain, between the left and right cerebral hemispheres. The major connection is the corpus callosum. I'm actually going to switch back to that video because it shows the corpus callosum really nicely. It's a very useful landmark as well. If you look here, it's kind of like a reverse upside down Nike symbol. That's the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum are axons that connect the left and right cerebral hemispheres. So we can divide up based on forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, left and right hemispheres. Functionally, the most interesting things. When I say interesting, what I really mean is the things that make us human, the things that separate us from a lot of other animals, are what go on in the highly folded part of our brain, the cerebral cortex. The cerebrum is just this whole big thing you see here. The outer portion of that big thing, the cerebral cortex, that's where most of our brain matter is. Cortex, this word means outer portion. Compare that with medulla. Medulla means inner portion. You'll see this naming convention for other organs as well. When we get to the kidney, the adrenal gland, you'll see an adrenal medulla, you'll see an adrenal cortex. Cerebral cortex is the outer portion of the brain. It's where you see all these gyri and sulci, all these folds, these peaks and valleys. So functionally, there is a difference between cerebral cortex and what we'll call subcortical areas. When we look at the cerebral cortex and at the rest of the central nervous system, we see a slight difference in color. It's not perfectly gray versus white, but that's the name that we've given to these areas of the brain and spinal cord. If you look at this frontal coronal cut of the brain, you'll notice that there's a slight darker tinge. This is not perfect coloration. This is an image. Darker brain material towards the outside, as well as in some places towards the middle, like here, 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 here. All of these areas are called gray matter. Gray matter. They're called gray matter because they're grayish. It's kind of like a darker pink in some cases. They're grayish. What you find here, the reason why they have this color, is because you have a lot of neuron cell bodies in these locations. Neuron cell bodies, those interneurons, they're found here. You find glial cells there too. Glial cells are everywhere in the nervous system. But if we're looking for neuron cell bodies, not neuron axons are in a different place. Neuron cell bodies are found in gray matter. This outer portion, the stuff that goes with all the gyri and sulci, this outer portion is cortex. Cortex is gray matter. We have cortex of the cerebrum, that's cerebral cortex. If we look at the cerebellum, we'll also see gray matter towards the outside, that's cerebellar cortex. But we can also find gray matter in some portions of the brain that are deeper. So not towards cortex, deeper parts. The term that we give to deeper parts of gray matter, these are called centers or nuclei. I know we've seen this word nucleus before, like for an atom or for a cell. Nucleus just means center of something. So when we say nuclei in terms of brain matter, we're talking about regions of gray matter where we find neuron cell bodies that are deeper in the brain. So we'll be going over something called the basal nuclei. Those are areas of gray matter deeper in the brain. Focusing more on the cerebral cortex, this is the most developed part of our brain. And it's what, again, sets us apart from other organisms. When we look at what we consider intelligent animals, like all the apes and closely related animals to us, whales and dolphins, elephants, they have really highly developed cerebral cortices. The cerebral cortex is an area that's generally important for cognitive processes. Cognitive, that means to think. So when we think, we mean to perceive something, to be aware of our surroundings, to be aware of ourselves, to have consciousness. It's not that other animals don't have these things, it's just not as developed. The ability to remember. Again, organisms, all kinds of organisms can remember things, but to what extent can they remember? We have a very developed sense of memory and different types of memory. We can recall things from the past, we can remember things physically, remember and associate smells and other senses. There are many different things we can remember. How we can pay attention, how we can develop language. Our language, of course, is very developed. You're understanding me right now, I hope. All that is processed by neurons in the cerebral cortex. Things deeper to the cerebral cortex, so everything else, we term as subcortical regions. And anything that's subcortical, so that would be the diencephalon, midbrain, pons, cerebellum, medulla oblongata. Anything that's subcortical, deeper to the cerebral cortex, those are generally more important for more vital functions, things you need to survive. Regulating your breathing, regulating your heart rate, your swallowing reflexes, temperature, blood pressure, sleep, all kinds of things you need to do to just live. Having memory and attention is super useful, but it's not. If you lose your memory, you can still survive. There are people with, say, Alzheimer's or other memory conditions that can survive for some time. But if you can't breathe, you're not going to live. So focusing more closely on the cerebral cortex, there's a lot of different regions here. So we're only going to go over some of the basics, some of the highlights of the cerebral cortex, but it's a mosaic. It's a whole bunch of specialized interactive regions. They do talk to one another, but there are specializations in different parts of the brain. I want to point out that the cerebral cortex is less than 5 millimeters thick, but it's dense. It's filled with neuron cell bodies, and these neuron cell bodies are important for processing a lot of what we do and what makes us human. So once again, it's only excuse me, it's only 5 millimeters thick, but it accounts for 80% of your total brain mass. It's very dense, increased surface area. You're fitting as many cells as you can to maximize your processing power. The name of the neurons that you can find within the cerebral cortex, they're called pyramidal cells. They're shaped like little pyramids. Here is a nice isolated stain of a neuron that's showing a pyramidal cell. You can see the cell body. Excuse my poor handwriting, my pen battery died. You can see the cell body right here. You can see dendrites extending off in one direction and then an axon going off in another direction. This is a multipolar interneuron. This pyramidal cell is a multipolar interneuron. Dendrite, cell body, axon, axon terminal are all found within the central nervous system. When we look at our histology, it's going to look more like this at the bottom right. You'll see the nice dark cell bodies, kind of triangular in shape, like a pyramid, and then dendrites extending. You can see the dendrites extending directly off of the cell body. What you can also see, gross anatomy, what we see in the cerebral cortex, is that it's divided into several regions. The name of these regions are lobes. There are 4 lobes. The one in the front, the one anterior lobe, is the frontal lobe. Posterior to the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe, and guess what? The parietal lobe corresponds to where the parietal bones are. Posterior to that, you have the occipital lobe, where the occipital bone is. And then laterally, you've got on either side a temporal lobe, right, where the temporal bone is. So these lobes are named corresponding to the bones that protect them. There is a little feature where you can distinguish between the frontal and parietal lobes. The name of this sulcus, this is the central sulcus. The central sulcus divides the frontal and parietal lobes. It's a major sulcus that runs all the way across from one side to the other around the brain. And I'll show you in a cadaver brain coming up. An area just anterior rostral to the central sulcus is a gyrus. This is called the precentral gyrus. And in this precentral gyrus are neurons that control our skeletal muscle movements. So this is known as the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. Me thinking about and therefore moving my hand, my muscles of the hand, is controlled by my primary motor cortex in my frontal lobe. So one important function of the frontal lobe is to control your skeletal muscle movements, conscious control of your skeletal muscle movements. Another thing that your frontal lobe can do, very generally, there's this area called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is important for decision-making, for inhibition control. It's that area that was damaged by Phineas Gage. And if you lose that, then you don't have good decision-making. You don't have good inhibition. There's other things too, like speech, but we're just skimming over that. There's a lot of other things we could discuss. But the things that I'd like you to know about frontal lobe are decision-making, executive control, and control of motor movements, skeletal muscle movements. Posterior and a little bit caudal to the central sulcus is another gyrus. This is the post-central gyrus. And the post-central gyrus is important for processing information, sensory information, for touch, temperature, pain, itch, muscle stretch, Golgi tendon organ, tendon stretch. If you remember, we talked about somatosensory receptors. Somatosensory receptors sense stuff from your body and eventually send it up to your brain in this area, the primary somatosensory cortex. So the primary somatosensory cortex is found in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. One important function of the parietal lobe is to process this type of sensory information. There's many kinds of senses, remember. So when I say this type of sensory information, I mean somatosensory information, touch, temperature, pain, itch, muscle stretch, tendon stretch, stuff like that. Your occipital lobe houses your visual cortex. Your occipital lobe houses your visual cortex. Your ability to see, you see with your eyes, of course, but that information gets sent eventually to your occipital lobe, to your visual cortex, to process that visual information. So you see with your eyes up here, that information gets sent to the back. Finally, your temporal lobe is lateral. One way you can distinguish temporal lobe from the other lobes is look for this deep sulcus that runs across here. This deep sulcus is known as the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. The temporal lobe is right by your ears, so thankfully it makes sense that this is an area for hearing, for processing hearing. Your auditory cortex. Your auditory cortex is found in your temporal lobes, processing what you hear. All of that was gray matter. The cerebral cortex is gray matter, where we find neuron cell bodies. Neurons need to communicate with each other within the brain, or to somewhere else in your body, or to send information to your brain. We have constant information going to and from the brain. So we need axons going to different places. We need a way to communicate. Axons group together in tracts. Axons group together in tracts in the central nervous system. Where you find white matter, or sorry, where you find axons, it's termed white matter. It is lighter in color. It's not perfectly white. It's a little light beige. But this lighter color is due to the myelination of axons. Myelin is made of, in this case, oligodendrocyte membranes, and membranes are made of phospholipids. Lipids stain lighter. There are few cell bodies found in white matter. You might find a sporadic neuron cell body. You can find glial cell bodies, but not very many neuron cell bodies. White matter tracts in the cerebrum allow for communication between brain regions. I pointed out earlier that corpus callosum, the corpus callosum is the major white matter tract that crosses hemispheres. Because it's crossing from left to right, the term for that is a commissural fiber. A commissural fiber. It's a commissure. Commissure, in this case, means axon tracts that span from left to right, right to left. It's not the only one. It's the major one. It's the biggest one. It's not the only one. The other commissure that we have, besides, let me draw the corpus callosum again. There's a corpus callosum. The other, another major one, there's actually more than this, but another major one that we can find in a cadaver brain that's been cut mid-sagittally is the anterior commissure. And the anterior commissure is very small. It's a small circle right here. Let me do that again. Right here. One more time. There we go. That is the anterior commissure. Much smaller, but again, axons are crossing from left to right, right to left. I point out both of these things are also very useful as landmarks to help figure out where everything is. The corpus callosum is surrounding the lateral ventricles. Remember, the lateral ventricles are right here. And then the hypothalamus, it's part of the diencephalon, is just underneath the anterior commissure. We'll learn what the hypothalamus is a bit later, but it's part of the diencephalon, just inferior to the anterior commissure. In this picture at the bottom, you can see corpus callosum and anterior commissure tracts going left and right. That's what this illustration is showing. So we can communicate between hemispheres with commissural fibers, for example, the corpus callosum and anterior commissure. We can communicate between cortex areas using something called association fibers. You might see them called arcuate fibers because they make an arc shape. Take a look at this mid-sagittal cut right here. If you want to talk from one cortical region to another, you just keep sending axons from one place to another place to another place. That's what these white matter tracts are. These are association fibers going from one cortical area to another within the same hemisphere. If you want to communicate to and from the brain, so down the spinal cord into your hand or to your legs, or from those organs and regions of your body up to your brain, we need to go up and down vertically. Those are called projection fibers. Projection fibers go up and down the brain. Projection fibers go up and down the brain. We use technical terms for up and down when we're talking about movement of axons, movement of information. To go down from the cerebral cortex to other areas, we say that we're descending. So there are descending tracts. To say that we're going up say we're sensing something, we sense something in our hand, and that information goes up to our brain, that information is ascending. Descending is going down from the brain down, usually for motor control or afferent control. Ascending is sensory, afferent input. You can see in this special image here, this image was taken using a special technique called diffusion tensor imaging. But I show this in this lateral view and in this anterior coronal frontal cut, the different types of tracts that we can see in these images. You can see arcuate fibers, association fibers going from one area to another. You can see commissural fibers in this view. And you can see projection fibers going up and down to and from the brain. I want to show everything that we just saw in a cadaver brain, so let me switch over to the videos. Here we can see the lateral surface of a brain, and they're showing off the gyri and sulci. Where we're looking right now, this sways anterior, that's the front of the brain, this is the frontal lobe. And this crevice right here, that's the central sulcus. So that means the precentral gyrus is what I'm highlighting in pink, and that means the post-central gyrus is what I'm highlighting in green. Down here, that's the lateral sulcus. Whoops, I'll do it again. This is the lateral sulcus. There is a division, there is a sulcus division between the parietal and occipital lobe, but very generally, occipital lobe is just way in the back here. That's the occipital lobe there in yellow. Parietal lobe, I'll outline fully in green. So P is for parietal, O is for occipital. We'll do blue for temporal. We'll do red. Whoops. Red for frontal. There are 4 lobes. I should say that there are 4 lobes that are actually visible from the surface of the brain. There's actually one more lobe, cortex, that's hidden. Let me clear this. This is a really folded brain. You could kind of peel these folds and look deeper. One of these folds, that lateral sulcus right here, is really deep. The lateral sulcus is really deep. So if you were to pry this open, you'd find even more cortex that's deeper to there. Right now we're looking at an anterior view. They have their thumbs in the longitudinal fissure. And once again, you can see the much deeper within. You can see the corpus callosum. You can see the corpus callosum connecting in between. But if we take a frontal cut, a coronal cut of the brain, and that's what this is, you can see longitudinal fissure. You can see the corpus callosum coming across here. You can see the lateral sulcus coming in here, and I told you it was pretty deep. And there's more cortex that's really deep in here. The term for this gray matter, it's kind of a fifth lobe. The term for this gray matter is the insular cortex. Insular because it's insulated, it's hiding. Let me use a different color there. Because it's hiding, it's folded over. What the insular cortex is important for is processing taste. Within the insular cortex, you have the gustatory cortex. Gustatory means it's referring to taste. So the gustatory cortex, where we process taste information, that's found within the insular cortex. All right, that wraps up our discussion of the cerebral cortex and the cerebrum as a whole. We'll actually talk more about the cerebrum, the subcortical areas in the next video. So I'll see you in the next video. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.